some IT issue. They're just trying to pull out the presentation. That's a PDF file. Yeah, that's the right one. No, I don't think I'm able to operate it from here. Again, apologies for this delay. I will talk about intellectual property valuation in a dispute scenario, and would also cover up some of the valuation methodologies that you would use for intellectual property and different kinds of intangibles. So let's have an overview of intellectual property market and the key concerns that we have in IP litigation scenario. Companies are acting aggressively to protect intellectual property rights at a time when these rights have been subject to greater scrutiny and higher standards of profits and litigation. Now, the scenario today is that people want to quantify the intellectual property rights, whether they are internally generated or they are acquired. And hence, there's a need for a quantitative economic analysis. There's a need to put a worth, there's a need to put a value to the intellectual property rights that are owned by the company. From high-stakes legal challenges in patent or other IP disputes to business scenarios involving IP strategies, quantitative economic analysis now plays a very essential role. And hence, there's a need for effective use of expert witnesses in IP litigation and exploiting the practice over here. Now, there are people and there are experts here who would carry out IP valuations, and we have a very distinguished panel sitting out here. What happens over time is when you start valuing these intellectual property rights, there's also a trend in the increase or decrease in value over time. Particularly in a dispute case of scenario, what is really important to understand and see how that value has changed over time. What are the factors responsible for that? If there has been a violation, if there has been an infringement, what are the facts relating to that and how that impacted the overall value? So we propose a three-step strategy to our clients when they come up with intellectual property or intangibles. The IP proactive reviews, IP investigations and evidence gathering, and finally IP dispute and litigation support, which is the ultimate stage where if you actually land up in a dispute or litigation kind of scenario, then how would you compute the damages, as was covered by Naresh in a previous presentation. IP proactive reviews. What are we really trying to say here? Conduct proactive review of the compliance of the licensing agreements. All the licensing agreements, especially in case of India, we have seen, and in pharmaceutical companies, the royalty rate arrangements or the agreements that have been drafted decades ago, they're very loosely drafted. And that is the cause of major dispute, because the royalty rates have not been assessed at a fair value. Sometimes, in some scenarios, they are a lump sum amount which are paid on an annual basis. Now that, especially from a transfer pricing perspective, poses a very significant challenge. Because if you want to go overseas and you want to transfer those IPR related to certain molecules so that you can exploit them in an overseas market, what should be the fair value or the royalty rate that you should consider? That becomes a very big question. Consolidate instances and degree of licensing violations. Assist in development of remediation plan for course correction. Review design of IP-related policies and suggest further strengthening. So there have to be watertight clauses within your agreement for the royalty rates or for the transfer of the IPR that would prevent any kind of dispute or litigation scenario in future. And at the end of this presentation, I will discuss about a case study where between a parent and a subsidiary, a brand was shared. It was legally owned by the parent, however, economically exploited by the subsidiary. And over there, you will see how it has resulted in a dispute scenario because the ownership of that brand or the trademark now becomes the biggest challenge. The second is IP investigation and evidence gathering. Conduct a fact-finding exercise to establish IP evaluations. Now we are at stage 2. we know there has been some violations. We need to do a fact-finding exercise to establish that, yes, there were these violations. Substantiate instances of violations with acceptable evidence. Apply forensic technology and market intelligence to establish with reasonable evidences that, yes, there was a violation. Establish the who, how, and when of the IP-related crime. And finally, we have the IP dispute and litigation support, where you would need an expert witness appearance in courts and arbitration. You would need computation of damages and claims in IP disputes. Some of it was already covered in the previous presentations. Computation of reasonable royalties. This is another area where, as I mentioned earlier, the royalty rate and how do you establish that it is reasonable is one of the big challenges that everyone is facing. Now, there are several market comparable transactions that one can refer to, but as someone previously said, you cannot have a perfect comparable. So you need to draw evidences, work on some fact-finding exercises, and take some averages or medians to come up with a closely comparable figure. And apply computer forensics for establishing facts in infringements. So very quickly, assistance in IP disputes. Computation of reasonable royalty, number one, that we discussed briefly. Determination of lost profits as damages. And third, determination of price erosion damages. Okay, the next couple of slides, I would give a very brief overview about different valuation methodologies that we have used in the past in case of dispute and litigation scenarios. Now, these valuation methods and approaches are applicable to several different kind of intangibles, and depending upon the purpose of the valuation and depending upon the kind of asset we are valuing, each of these approaches and methodologies would differ. So as has been previously discussed, there's a market approach, there's an income approach, and cost approach. So basically dividing the valuation approaches under three heads, and within each head you have different methodologies. Within market approach, you have a market price on active markets. If the asset is publicly listed, you would have the trading points which you can use as support for the valuation analysis. However, this is found very rare, especially in case of intangibles. The second is an analogy method where you try and find a closely comparable asset, and I use the word closely comparable because, as I said earlier, it's very difficult to find a perfect comparable. And then you try and benchmark the royalty range arrangements or the valuation or the transaction values of those assets in comparison to the subject asset that you are valuing. Under income approach, you have four different methods, so to say, and there may be more as followed by interbrand or brand finance. The first is the relief from royalty method, then a multi-period excess earnings method, incremental cash flow method or a profit premium method, and direct cash flow method, greenfield or a common DCF as we say. Finally, we have the cost approach, and we have the reproduction cost and the replacement cost. The market approach. The market approach is a process by which a fair value estimate to derive by analyzing similar intangible assets that have recently been sold or licensed and then comparing their transaction to the subject intangible asset. Here, once again, the focus is on comparability with the subject asset that you are valuing. Similar transaction considerations, identification and comparability of transaction and adjustments to the market-based data. Typically, even if you are able to identify certain transactions or certain licenses that are comparable to the subject asset that you're valuing, we may want to make an adjustment to those kind of arrangements. In one of the previous presentations, we talked about complex royalty rate arrangements in which there is a lump sum payment in the beginning, and then there's a royalty as a percentage of net sales that is followed. In such kind of transaction, it's very difficult to apply that kind of a royalty rate to our intangible. For the simple reason, a bulk of that worth of that intangible is paid out already as a lump sum amount in the beginning. So these are some of the cautions that we need to take care of while valuing or while using, say, a relief from royalty method or using a comparable method where you look at the market transactions. Income approach, basically an excess earnings, royalty savings, a DCF, or the final method over there. All these methods are different variants of income approach, and I don't think I'm going to go into the details of these, because they basically, all of them refer in some form or the other the present value of the future excess earnings or the future earnings that the intangible is able to generate. So the moment you're able to establish the future earnings for the intangibles, you take the present value and you calculate the present value of that, and you arrive at the fair value. Depending on the kind of intangible you have, one or other of these four methodologies you can use to value the intangibles. A cost approach is based upon the economic principle of basically attaining a price equilibrium, and what is the similar available asset or a software in the market, and what is the cost to replace that. Here you would have two methods under a cost approach. One is a reproduction cost, another one is a replacement cost. Basically what this means is, in a reproduction cost, what is the cost